There is a particular kind of ambition that is born not from confidence, but from terror. The terror of being forgotten. The terror of dying as you were born, small, poor, and invisible. Andrew Carnegie understood this terror intimately. He lived with it his entire life. And on the corner of 5th Avenue and 91st Street in Manhattan, he built his answer to it. The Carnegie Mansion was not simply a home. It was an argument made in steel, limestone, and 64 rooms, that a boy from a weaver's cottage in Dunfermline, Scotland, had arrived, not just to America, not just to wealth, but to permanence. Andrew Carnegie was born in 1835 in a single-room cottage in Dunfermline, Scotland. His father, William, was a hand-loom weaver, a trade that the Industrial Revolution was quietly, ruthlessly destroying. When Carnegie was 13, the family had no choice. They borrowed money from relatives and sailed for America, landing in 1848 with little more than the clothes on their backs, and a fierce, almost religious belief that hard work could transform a life. What is often softened in the Carnegie legend is how visceral that poverty was. The family arrived in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, a grimy industrial town across the river from Pittsburgh. Carnegie went to work almost immediately. First as a bobbin boy in a cotton factory, earning $1.20 a week. Then as a telegraph messenger. Then as a telegraph operator. He was sharp, relentlessly observant, possessed of a memory that bordered on the photographic. He taught himself to read stock tickers by sound. He charmed his employers. He made himself indispensable. But beneath all of it ran something that wealth never fully quieted: the memory of his father's humiliation, of a skilled craftsman made obsolete by machines, of a family that had to borrow money to escape. Carnegie would spend the rest of his life ensuring that no one, not the markets, not his rivals, not time itself, could do to him what industrialization had done to William Carnegie. By the time Carnegie commissioned his Manhattan mansion in 1899, he was almost certainly the richest private individual on Earth. His fortune came from steel, specifically from Carnegie Steel, the company he had built into an industrial colossus that produced more steel than the entire nation of Great Britain. But the story of how that steel was made is not a comfortable one. Carnegie Steel ran on the labor of immigrant workers, Slavic, Hungarian, Italian, who worked 12-hour shifts 7 days a week in furnace heat that regularly killed and maimed. The mills operated around the clock. Safety was secondary to output. And Carnegie, publicly, was a man who claimed to love his workers. He wrote about the dignity of labor. He declared that the relationship between capital and worker was one of mutual respect and shared interest. Then came Homestead. In 1892, 7 years before Carnegie began planning his mansion, his business partner, Henry Clay Frick, locked out the unionized workers at the Homestead Steelworks near Pittsburgh. He hired 300 Pinkerton detectives to break the strike by force. The confrontation that followed left workers dead on the riverbanks. Carnegie was in Scotland when it happened. Conveniently distant, some said deliberately so. He never publicly condemned Frick's methods. He sent private letters of support. The union was crushed. Wages were cut. And Carnegie's profits climbed. The mansion on 5th Avenue was funded, in no small part, by what was extracted at Homestead. Carnegie understood, better than almost anyone, that raw wealth without a moral framework was politically dangerous. He had watched the robber barons of his era, the Vanderbilts, the Goulds, the Fisks, accumulate fortunes and inspire rage. He did not intend to be hated. He intended to be loved. More than that, he intended to be remembered. In 1889, he published his famous essay, The Gospel of Wealth. Its argument was striking in its directness. A man who dies rich dies disgraced. The wealthy have a moral obligation to distribute their fortunes for the public good during their own lifetimes. It was a genuinely radical idea, and Carnegie meant it. Or at least, he meant enough of it to give away the vast majority of his fortune before he died. But the gospel of wealth also served another function. It reframed the story. Instead of, "Here is a man whose workers died so that he could accumulate billions," the story became, "Here is a man who gave it all back." The philanthropy was real. The libraries, the concert halls, the university, the peace institutes, they were real. But they also functioned as a narrative correction. Carnegie was acutely aware of his public image. He managed it with the same strategic intelligence he applied to his business empire. The mansion was part of this management. He did not build a chateau in the style of the Vanderbilts, those French limestone fantasies that dripped with European aristocratic pretension. Carnegie chose Georgian revival, restrained, dignified, intellectual, the home of a man of substance and culture, not mere vulgarity. The architect firm Babb, Cook, and Willard delivered exactly what Carnegie wanted, a house that said, "I am serious," not, "I am obscene." Carnegie moved into the mansion in 1902, at the age of 66. He was already deep into his philanthropic mission. Carnegie Steel had been sold to J.P. Morgan the previous year for $480 million, a transaction that made Carnegie, in a single afternoon, the richest man in the world. He had his fortune. Now he needed his legacy. The mansion served that legacy in several ways simultaneously. It was a private retreat. Carnegie genuinely loved the house, loved the garden, loved the conservatory where he could sit among his plants in the morning light that the glass ceiling approximated. It was a family home where his daughter Margaret grew up, and where his wife Louise anchored a domestic life that Carnegie, for all his public restlessness, clearly needed. But it was also a stage, a controlled environment in which Andrew Carnegie could present himself to politicians, to intellectuals, to the press, to the powerful, as a man of refinement, culture, and serious purpose. The library, lined with the books he had loved since a generous Pittsburgh merchant had opened his personal collection to working boys on Saturday afternoons, was the room that mattered most to him. It was proof, displayed in leather and gilt, of how far he had traveled from Dunfermline. And here is the central tension that the mansion embodies, the tension that no amount of philanthropy can entirely dissolve. Carnegie believed, with apparent sincerity, in the dignity of the working man. He also built a fortune on the suppression of that working man's right to organize, to bargain, and to share in the wealth he produced. He gave away libraries to the public, and those libraries were often in the same towns where his mills operated under conditions that made reading, let alone leisure, a fantasy for the workers inside them. The mansion on Fifth Avenue is not a monument to hypocrisy exactly. Carnegie was not a simple villain. He was something more human and more troubling than that. A man of genuine ideals who found, again and again, that when the ideals conflicted with the money won, and who then spent the rest of his life building institutions grand enough to obscure that fact. The building is beautiful. The story behind it is not simple, and that tension between the beauty and the cost is what makes it worth telling. In 1899, Andrew Carnegie made a decision that his contemporaries found quietly baffling. He was, by any measure, the richest man in America. He could have built anything. He could have erected a palace that would have made Versailles feel modest. The Vanderbilts had already shown what unlimited money looked like when applied to limestone and ambition. Their Fifth Avenue mansions were essentially French chateaux transplanted to Manhattan, dripping with turrets, towers, and the kind of ornamental excess that announced wealth the way a trumpet announces a parade. Carnegie built none of that. What rose on the corner of Fifth Avenue and 91st Street between 1899 and 1902 was something altogether different. And the difference was deliberate, calculated, and deeply revealing about the man who commissioned it. Carnegie selected the firm of Babb, Cook, and Willard to design his mansion. This was not the most fashionable choice available to him. Richard Morris Hunt, the architect who had designed the Vanderbilt estates, was the reigning monarch of Gilded Age excess. McKim, Mead, and White were producing some of the most talked-about buildings in New York. Carnegie chose neither. Babb, Cook, and Willard were respected, serious, and somewhat restrained, precisely the qualities Carnegie was signaling. George Fletcher Babb, in particular, was known for his careful, scholarly approach to architecture. He was not a showman, he was a craftsman, and Carnegie, who had spent his entire career carefully distinguishing himself from the vulgarity of mere display, wanted a craftsman. The commission carried an unusual instruction. Carnegie told his architects he wanted the most modest, the most comfortable, and the most spacious house in New York City. The word modest is worth pausing on. Coming from a man spending somewhere between $2 and $3 million on a private home, equivalent to well over $60 million today, it tells you everything about how Carnegie understood the performance of wealth. Modest, in his vocabulary, did not mean small. It meant tasteful. It meant not shouting. It meant winning the room by understatement rather than volume. The style chosen was Georgian Revival, a mode drawn from the restrained, symmetrical architecture of 18th century Britain. Red brick facade, regular window spacing, understated classical detailing, no turrets, no Gothic fantasy, no imported French stone trying to pretend it had always been in Manhattan. The message was pointed. The Vanderbilt Chateau announced, "We are so rich we can transplant European aristocracy to American soil." The Carnegie Mansion announced something different. "We have taste, restraint, and intellectual seriousness." It was the architectural equivalent of Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth, a calculated repositioning away from naked excess toward a kind of elevated, responsible prosperity. There was also something personally meaningful in the choice of Georgian Revival. The style had its roots in Britain, in the same country Carnegie had left as a boy of 13. But where he had left poverty and obscurity, he was now returning, in architectural spirit, to the finest traditions of British civic and domestic design. The weaver's son from Dunfermline was building himself a house in the idiom of British gentry. That irony was not lost on Carnegie, and there is every reason to believe he savored it. The mansion rose 6 stories on a plot that Carnegie had deliberately chosen for its distance from the crowded social theater of Lower Fifth Avenue. In 1899, 91st Street was considered by many to be extravagantly far uptown, almost rural in its remove from the city's fashionable center. Carnegie didn't care. He wanted space. He wanted land. And he wanted a garden. The building contained approximately 64 rooms across its 6 floors. The ground floor held the formal public rooms, the entrance hall, the great staircase, the dining room capable of seating large dinner parties, and the library that Carnegie considered the true heart of the house. Above were the family's private apartments. Below, in the basement levels, was the working infrastructure of the household: kitchens, laundries, storage, boiler rooms, staff quarters, an entire hidden city that kept the visible house functioning. The great staircase deserves particular attention. Constructed of marble and dark wood, it rose through the house with a grandeur that was genuinely theatrical without being ostentatious. It was the kind of architectural statement that announced the house's ambitions quietly, through proportion and material quality rather than ornament. Visitors ascending that staircase understood, without being told, that they were in a serious house belonging to a serious man. Carnegie was, above all else, an industrialist. He understood technology not as luxury, but as competitive advantage. And the mansion he built reflected this instinct. It was, for its time, one of the most technically advanced private residences in New York City. The building was among the first private homes in Manhattan to be constructed with a steel frame, a direct expression of the industry that had made Carnegie's fortune. This was not merely symbolic. A steel frame allowed for larger, more open interior spaces, greater structural flexibility, and a building that could support the weight of its own ambitions in ways that traditional masonry construction could not. The mansion was fully electrified at a time when electricity in private homes remained far from universal. It had its own boiler system, capable of providing central heating throughout its 64 rooms. Elevators connected the floors. There was a sophisticated system of speaking tubes and call bells linking every significant room to the service quarters below, allowing the household's invisible labor force to be summoned, directed, and coordinated without ever visibly intruding on the domestic life being performed above. And then there was the conservatory. A glass-enclosed garden space attached to the house, it was perhaps Carnegie's most personal indulgence. He was devoted to it. In the mornings, particularly in winter, he would sit among the plants and the filtered light, and whatever portion of him still belonged to the gray skies of Dunfermline seems to have found some peace there. The conservatory required its own heating system, its own irrigation, its own maintenance regime. It was, functionally, a small climate-controlled world built for one man's comfort. The construction cost of the Carnegie Mansion is generally cited at somewhere between $1.5 and $3 million. What is certain is that the furnishing, art acquisition, and landscaping added substantially to this figure. Carnegie furnished the house with genuine seriousness, quality materials, quality craftsmanship, a library collection that was not decorative but actually read. The annual operating cost of maintaining the mansion, staff wages, utilities, maintenance, food, and the 100 other expenses of running a 64-room household was substantial by any measure. Estimates placed the yearly running costs at figures that would have been beyond the lifetime earnings of most of the immigrant workers in Carnegie's steel mills. This contrast is not incidental. It is structural. The mansion's operating economics were only possible because of the labor economics of Carnegie Steel. The two systems, the gleaming house on Fifth Avenue and the furnace floors of Pittsburgh, were not separate worlds. They were the same world, seen from opposite ends. Step back from the individual rooms and the technical specifications and the construction costs and ask the larger question. What was this building actually communicating? It was saying, first, that Andrew Carnegie had arrived, not merely as a rich man, but as a civilized one. The restraint of the Georgian Revival style, the emphasis on the library over the ballroom, the garden over the grand gallery, these were all arguments that Carnegie's wealth had been transmuted into something higher than mere accumulation. He was not a Vanderbilt, hoarding European art and building French fantasies. He was a man of culture, of books, of considered taste. It was saying, second, that Carnegie understood permanence. The steel frame, the quality of materials, the solidity of construction, these were not the choices of a man building for a season. They were the choices of a man building for centuries. Carnegie wanted his house to outlast him. He wanted it to stand as evidence, long after he was gone, that he had been here, and that he had mattered. It was saying, third, though Carnegie would never have stated this directly, that the system that had produced this house was justified, that the wealth concentrated in these rooms was not obscene, but earned, that the distance between the mansion and the mill was not a moral failure, but a natural consequence of talent, ambition, and the proper operation of the American dream. The building made that argument in brick and limestone and steel. Whether you believe it is another matter entirely. There is a version of the Carnegie Mansion that most people encounter. It is the version of the formal. Rooms, the marble staircase, the conservatory, the library with its leather-bound volumes and morning light. It is the version of taste and restraint and civilized prosperity. It is, in every sense, the version that was designed to be seen. Then there is the other version, the version that existed behind the walls, below the floors, and inside the narrow service corridors that ran parallel to the grand hallways like a shadow city. This version was never meant to be seen. It was meant to function, quietly, invisibly, and without interruption, so that the visible version could maintain its illusion of effortless grace. Understanding the Carnegie Mansion means understanding both versions simultaneously, because the beauty of one was only possible because of the labor of the other. A household of 64 rooms in Edwardian New York did not run itself. It required a small army, a precisely ranked, carefully managed workforce whose entire professional existence was organized around the comfort and convenience of the family they served. The Carnegie household employed somewhere between 30 and 40 domestic servants at its peak operational period in the early 1900s. What is documented is the hierarchy, the elaborate pyramid of labor that made the house function as a seamless organism. At the top sat the butler, the most senior servant in the household, responsible for the overall management of the male staff, the supervision of the formal dining service, the security of the silver, and the coordination of the household's public face. Below him, the housekeeper held equivalent authority over the female staff, the maids, the laundresses, the kitchen workers. These two figures formed the operational command of the household. They reported to Carnegie's wife, Louise, who managed the domestic world of the mansion with the same quiet authority that Andrew brought to his business affairs. Below this senior tier descended an intricate structure: a lady's maid for Louise Carnegie, a personal valet for Andrew, footmen for the formal rooms, parlor maids, housemaids responsible for the upper floors, kitchen maids working beneath the cook, a laundress and her assistants, a hall boy at the very bottom of the indoor hierarchy. Outside, a separate staff maintained the grounds and the garden. The conservatory alone required dedicated horticultural attention throughout the year. The Carnegie Mansion was not simply a house that happened to employ servants. It was a building architecturally engineered around the principle that labor should be invisible. Running through the building, largely hidden from the formal rooms, was a network of service corridors and back staircases, narrower than the main passages, undecorated, functional. These routes allowed servants to move through the house carrying coal, clean linen, breakfast trays, and the 100 other physical materials of daily life without ever crossing the sightlines of family or guests. The kitchen and its associated service rooms, the scullery, the larder, the butler's pantry, the silver room, the laundry, occupied the basement levels entirely. This was deliberate. The sounds, smells, and physical reality of the work that sustained the household were buried underground, as far as possible from the rooms where that household performed its social life. The call bell system completed this architecture of separation. From any significant room, a family member could summon a servant without moving, without raising their voice, without acknowledging in any direct way the labor infrastructure that surrounded them. A bell rang somewhere below. Feet moved through the service corridor. A door opened. The required service materialized, as if from nowhere, and then withdrew. The system was elegant. It was also, in its quiet way, a precise physical expression of the class structure that made the mansion possible. What did it actually mean to work in the Carnegie Mansion? The hours were long, typically between 14 and 16 hours a day for most indoor staff, with half a day off per week as the standard allowance in households of this era. Staff were expected to be available whenever required, which in practice meant that the boundaries between working hours and personal time were largely theoretical. A housemaid's day began before the family woke. Fires to be set, grates cleaned, breakfast rooms prepared. And it ended after the family retired. The physical demands were considerable. Coal had to be carried from the basement to fireplaces throughout the house. Hot water, before the mansion's plumbing systems were fully operational, was carried in pitchers. Laundry for a household of this scale, the table linens alone for a formal dinner represented hours of washing, starching, and ironing, was a continuous industrial operation conducted largely by hand. Wages for domestic servants in New York in the early 1900s ranged from approximately $2 per week for junior kitchen staff to perhaps $40 or $50 per month for a senior butler or housekeeper. Room and board were provided, which employers of the era consistently used to justify wage levels that would otherwise have been understood as inadequate. The live-in nature of domestic service also meant that staff were, in a very practical sense, never entirely off-duty. They slept in the house they served, they ate in its kitchens, their personal lives existed within its walls, and therefore within its rules. Staff were expected to be invisible in presence as well as in movement. Eye contact with the family was generally discouraged. Conversation beyond what was strictly required by the task at hand was not appropriate. A servant who encountered Andrew Carnegie on the main staircase was expected to step aside, avert their gaze, and allow him to pass as though the encounter had not occurred. And here is one of the most uncomfortable truths about the history of the Carnegie Mansion. We know almost nothing about the individual people who kept it running. We know Carnegie's architects, we know his dinner guests, we know the titles of the books in his library, we know the dimensions of his conservatory, we know what he paid for his steel mills and what he received when he sold them. We do not know, with any precision, the names of the women who made his bed each morning. We do not know the name of the man who carried coal to his study fire on winter evenings. We do not know what the kitchen staff ate for their own meals, or where they came from, or what happened to them when their service in the household ended. This invisibility was not accidental. It was built into the system. Physically, in the architecture of the service corridors, and culturally, in the conventions of an era that treated domestic labor as infrastructure rather than as human experience. The mansion was designed to make the labor disappear, and in the historical record, it largely succeeded. There is a comparison that cannot be avoided, and that the mansion's architecture makes physically concrete. Andrew Carnegie built his fortune on a workforce that he paid as little as the market would allow, worked as hard as the machinery demanded, and suppressed whenever they attempted to organize for better conditions. The Homestead Strike of 1892 was the most dramatic expression of this system, but it was not an aberration. It was the system, operating as designed. The domestic staff of the Carnegie Mansion were part of a different labor market, governed by different conventions. But the underlying logic was not entirely dissimilar. Labor was a cost to be minimized, a function to be performed, a presence to be managed and contained. The service corridors of the mansion and the mill floors of Pittsburgh were separated by several hundred miles and an enormous social distance. The principle organizing both was the same: that certain people's time, comfort, and visibility mattered infinitely more than others. Carnegie spoke often about the obligations of wealth. He built libraries so that working men could educate themselves toward better lives. He endowed concert halls and universities and peace institutes. He believed, or persuaded himself that he believed, in the possibility of human dignity across class lines. And every morning, in a narrow corridor behind the walls of his library, someone who would never be named in any history of the house carried a tray of breakfast through the hidden passages of his home. Careful not to make a sound, that person was real. That labor was real. And the mansion, for all its Georgian restraint, its leather-bound books, its morning conservatory light, could not have existed for a single day without it. A mansion of 64 rooms in Edwardian Manhattan was not, in any meaningful sense, simply a place to live. It was an instrument, a carefully calibrated machine for the production and maintenance of social power. Every dinner invitation issued from its address, Every guest list curated for its formal dining room, every afternoon reception held in its drawing rooms, these were not acts of casual hospitality. They were acts of strategy. Andrew Carnegie understood this with the clarity of a man who had spent his entire adult life reading rooms. From the telegraph offices of his youth, where he had learned to charm employers and make himself indispensable, to the boardrooms of Pittsburgh, where he had outmaneuvered rivals with a combination of charm and ruthlessness that his competitors consistently underestimated, Carnegie had always known that the social world was not separate from the professional world. It was an extension of it. And the mansion on Fifth Avenue was the finest instrument he had ever possessed for conducting that world on his own terms. To understand who came through the Carnegie Mansion's doors is to understand the architecture of American power at the turn of the 20th century. Presidents came. Theodore Roosevelt, whose own appetite for vigorous public life made him a natural companion for Carnegie's restless energy, was among the mansion's visitors. William Howard Taft followed. The relationship between Carnegie and the American presidency was not that of a supplicant seeking favor. It was closer to a negotiation between equals, each possessing something the other needed. Carnegie had money, public influence, and a philanthropic platform that no politician could afford to ignore. The presidents had legitimacy, policy leverage, and the kind of institutional authority that even Carnegie's billions could not purchase outright. Beyond the presidents came the intellectuals, the writers, thinkers, and public figures whose presence in Carnegie's drawing rooms served a specific purpose. Mark Twain was a frequent visitor, and the friendship between the two men was genuine, though not uncomplicated. Twain had his own pointed views about accumulated wealth and its moral implications, and he was not a man who softened them for the sake of a good dinner. That Carnegie continued to invite him suggests either a genuine tolerance for dissent or a confidence that the mansion's atmosphere could contain it. Matthew Arnold came. Herbert Spencer, whose social Darwinist philosophy Carnegie had absorbed and adapted into his own worldview, had visited Carnegie in earlier years. Kipling during his American period. Scientists, educators, diplomats, the librarians and university presidents who administered Carnegie's philanthropic network, the peace activists whose causes Carnegie funded with increasing intensity as his life moved toward its final decade. This was not a random collection of distinguished people. It was a curated network, maintained with considerable deliberate effort, that served Carnegie's twin obsessions, his business legacy and his philanthropic reputation. Any honest account of life inside the Carnegie Mansion must acknowledge what histories of the period sometimes obscure. The social world of the house was not Andrew Carnegie's creation alone. It was, in very large part, the creation of his wife. Louise Whitfield Carnegie was 21 years younger than her husband and possessed of a social intelligence that complemented his in ways that the mansion's guest books quietly document. Where Carnegie was direct, sometimes blunt, occasionally tactless in the way of a man who had always been the most powerful person in any room, Louise was careful, attentive, and skilled at the thousand small acts of social management that turned a dinner party from a gathering of powerful people into an occasion that everyone present remembered as a success. She managed the household social calendar with the precision of an executive. The invitations, the seating arrangements, which in a room of senators, diplomats, and industrialists carried their own political freight. The menu consultations with the cook, the flower arrangements, the orchestration of the drawing room conversation after dinner. These were not trivial concerns. In a social world where the memory of a badly managed evening could damage a relationship that had taken years to build, they were the substance of the work. Louise also shaped the mansion's domestic identity in ways that went beyond entertaining. She was the one who made it a home rather than a stage, who ensured that the conservatory remained a genuine space of private retreat, who established the rhythms of family life that gave the house its character beyond its formal functions. Carnegie depended on this more than he typically acknowledged publicly. The formal dining room of the Carnegie Mansion was where the mansion's social function expressed itself most completely. Dinner in a house of this scale and ambition in Edwardian New York was not a meal. It was a performance, multi-act, carefully staged, governed by conventions so precise that a deviation from them was itself a social statement. The silver, heavy, monogrammed, arranged according to protocols that the butler staff rehearsed with the seriousness of a military operation, caught the candlelight with a warmth that was itself a form of argument. The food came from kitchens 2 floors below, carried up by footmen who had been drilled in the mechanics of formal service until the transfer of a soup course from kitchen to table had achieved something approaching choreographic precision. The wine was selected with care. The flowers were fresh. And the conversation, among guests who had been specifically chosen for their ability to perform at this level, moved through politics and philanthropy and literature with the practiced ease of people who did this regularly. Carnegie, at the head of his table, presided. He was a good host, warm, funny in the specific Scottish manner that tends toward dry observation rather than performance, genuinely curious about the people around him. He asked questions. He remembered what people had told him at the last dinner and followed up on it at the next. These were not calculated social techniques in the cynical sense. They were expressions of a genuine interest in people that had survived intact from the telegraph office boy who had charmed everyone he met. But they also served a purpose. Every guest who left the Carnegie Mansion feeling seen, feeling heard, feeling that the evening had been precisely the kind of encounter that justified their place in the world, that guest was more likely to support Carnegie's causes, to defend his reputation when it came under attack, to extend to him the benefit of the doubt when the newspapers revisited Homestead. The dinner table was, among other things, a form of reputation management, conducted in 3 courses and a dessert. For all its openness to the powerful and the celebrated, the Carnegie Mansion maintained its exclusions with the same quiet efficiency that it maintained its service corridors. The social world of Fifth Avenue in the Edwardian era was structured by exclusions so normalized that they rarely required explicit statement. Jewish families of comparable or greater wealth found the doors of certain houses closed to them without explanation, a pattern of anti-Semitic exclusion that ran through the upper registers of New York society with a consistency that its practitioners preferred not to examine directly. Black Americans of achievement and distinction inhabited a parallel social world that intersected with Fifth Avenue almost not at all. The working class, Carnegie's workers, the people whose labor had produced the wealth being celebrated at these dinners, were present in the house only in the form of the staff who served the meal, and then withdrew through the service door. Carnegie's philanthropy was, in genuine ways, more democratic than his social world. The libraries he built were open to everyone. The concert halls were public. The educational institutions he funded served populations that would never have appeared on his guest lists. But the mansion itself, the inner sanctum, the dinner table, the drawing room, was reserved for a particular kind of person, powerful, educated, white, Protestant, or at minimum socially assimilated to Protestant norms, the kind of person whose presence confirmed, by their very attendance, that Carnegie had fully arrived in the world he had spent his life trying to enter. The door was beautifully made, and it did not open for everyone. There is a moment in the life of almost every great fortune where the story of how it was made becomes impossible to separate from the story of what it cost other people. For Andrew Carnegie, that moment has a name, a date, and a body count. Homestead, July 1892. Everything that Carnegie built afterward, the libraries, the concert halls, the peace institutes, the mansion on Fifth Avenue, the entire elaborate architecture of his philanthropic legacy exists in the shadow of what happened on the banks of the Monongahela River in the summer of 1892. Not because Homestead was unique in the history of American industrial labor. It was not. But because the contradiction between what Carnegie said he believed and what he permitted to happen there was so stark, so documented, and so consequential that no amount of subsequent generosity has entirely dissolved it. This is the chapter the mansion's drawing rooms were designed to make you forget. To understand the weight of Homestead, you first have to understand what Carnegie had publicly committed himself to in the years preceding it. He was not, by the standards of his era, a silent capitalist. He wrote, he theorized, he published essays in prominent magazines that laid out, with considerable rhetorical confidence, his views on the relationship between capital and labor. And those views were, on their face, strikingly progressive for a man of his position. Carnegie argued that workers deserved a share in the prosperity their labor created. He argued against the use of replacement workers during strikes, calling it dishonorable and destructive to the trust between employer and employee. He wrote that the right of workers to organize was legitimate and should be respected. He positioned himself, publicly and repeatedly, as a different kind of industrialist, one who understood that the men in his mills were not merely inputs to a production equation, but human beings with legitimate claims on the wealth they helped generate. These were not throwaway remarks. They were the considered positions of a man who understood that his public reputation was an asset as valuable as his steel mills. Carnegie Steel's Homestead Works, located on the Monongahela River near Pittsburgh, was one of the most productive steel mills in the world by 1892. It was also a unionized facility. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers had organized its skilled workers, and the relationship between the union and Carnegie Steel had been, if not warm, at least functional. That changed when the existing contract came up for renewal. Henry Clay Frick, whom Carnegie had installed as chairman of Carnegie Steel, presented the union with new terms that represented a substantial wage reduction for a significant portion of the workforce. The union rejected them. Frick responded by announcing that Carnegie Steel would henceforth operate as a non-union facility and began constructing a wooden fence topped with barbed wire and equipped with searchlights and rifle ports around the perimeter of the Homestead Works. Workers immediately nicknamed it Fort Frick. Carnegie was in Scotland. He had been in Scotland for the entire period leading up to the confrontation, at his castle at Cluny and then at Rannoch Lodge. This timing has been examined by historians with varying conclusions, some treating it as a convenient absence that allowed Carnegie to claim ignorance of Frick's methods while privately supporting them. Others arguing that Carnegie genuinely underestimated how far Frick intended to go. What is documented is the private correspondence. Carnegie's letters to Frick during this period do not show a man trying to restrain his partner's methods. They show a man who supported the objective, breaking the union, cutting wages, establishing non-union operations, while preferring not to be personally associated with the means by which it was achieved. On the night of the 5th of July, Frick made his move. 300 Pinkerton detectives, armed, hired specifically for the purpose of breaking the lockout, were loaded onto barges on the Ohio River and transported toward the Homestead Works under cover of darkness. The workers, who had been maintaining a round-the-clock watch on the river, spotted them before dawn. By morning, a battle had begun on the riverbank that lasted through the day. When it ended, 7 workers and 3 Pinkertons were dead. Dozens more on both sides were wounded. The Pinkertons were eventually forced to surrender. They were marched through a corridor of workers and their families and beaten as they passed. The images that emerged, of armed private detectives hired to suppress American workers, of men dead on a riverbank over the question of wages, shocked a significant portion of the American public. The National Guard arrived, restored order, and protected the resumption of non-union operations. The Amalgamated Association was effectively destroyed at Homestead. Wages were cut. The 12-hour shift, 7 days a week, became standard. Carnegie Steel's profits increased. What did Andrew Carnegie say publicly about Homestead? Very little, and very carefully. He issued a statement expressing regret for the violence, while carefully avoiding any direct criticism of Frick's methods or any acknowledgement that his own policies had created the conditions for the confrontation. He wrote privately to Frick, and here the historical record is damning, expressing his solidarity with the outcome while distancing himself from the optics. In one letter, he told Frick that he had surpassed all previous efforts, that the results spoke for themselves. He did not return to America during the crisis. He did not visit Homestead. He did not meet with the workers or their families. He did not publicly defend the right to organize that he had so prominently championed in his essays. The gap between the public philosopher of labor relations and the private partner to Frick's methods was not a subtle one. It was the width of the Monongahela River, measured in the distance between Carnegie's Scottish castle and the barges moving through the darkness toward men who believed, on the basis of his own published words, that he respected them. It is not a coincidence that Carnegie's philanthropic giving accelerated dramatically in the years following Homestead. The library building program, which became the most visible expression of his generosity, intensified through the 1890s and into the early 1900s. The timing is not proof of a direct causal relationship. Carnegie had been interested in public libraries since his youth, but it is suggestive. A man who had publicly committed himself to the dignity of working people, and who had then permitted those people to be shot on a riverbank in defense of his profit margins, had a considerable reputational debt to service. The libraries were real. The music halls were real. The universities and peace institutes and endowments were real. Carnegie gave away, over the course of his lifetime, the equivalent of billions in today's money, and he did so with a consistency and seriousness of purpose that mere guilt alone cannot entirely explain. But the philanthropy also functioned as a narrative architecture. Every library opened in a working-class town was a counterstory to Homestead. Every concert hall named Carnegie was an invitation to associate that name with culture and generosity, rather than with Pinkertons and barbed wire and men dead on a riverbank. The gospel of wealth, which Carnegie continued to refine and promote throughout this period, offered a moral framework in which the accumulation of wealth by men like Carnegie was not merely acceptable, but actively beneficial, because those men would redistribute it for the common good. The framework was not dishonest exactly, but it was convenient. And it required, for its coherence, that you not look too directly at how the wealth was accumulated in the first place. Mark Twain, who dined at the Carnegie Mansion and maintained a complicated friendship with its owner, was one of the few people in Carnegie's social circle with both the standing and the temperament to say directly what others preferred to leave unsaid. Twain observed, with a precision that made him dangerous, that Carnegie's philanthropy and Carnegie's labor practices were not two separate stories. They were one story, told from two different directions. The money that built the libraries came from somewhere. The somewhere had a name. Twain also noted, with characteristic dryness, that Carnegie seemed genuinely to believe in his own virtue, that the capacity for self-justification in a man of Carnegie's intelligence and rhetorical ability was itself a remarkable and somewhat terrifying phenomenon. That observation cuts to the heart of what makes Carnegie genuinely difficult rather than simply villainous. He was not a man without conscience. He was a man whose conscience had learned, over decades of practice, to accommodate itself to the requirements of his ambition. Return now to the Carnegie Mansion, to its Georgian restraint, its library, its conservatory, its curated guest lists and carefully managed dinner tables, and hold it alongside Homestead. The mansion was commissioned 7 years after the strike. It was built with money that the crushing of the Amalgamated Association had helped protect and increase. Its annual operating costs, the staff wages, the heating, the fresh flowers in the drawing room, were sustained by a fortune whose foundations included the homestead dead. Carnegie never said this. The mansion's architecture did not say it. Dinner conversations in the formal dining room did not say it. The guest books and the photographs and the carefully preserved records of the house's social life do not say it. But it is true. And the building cannot be fully understood without it. There is a particular kind of ending that does not arrive as a single dramatic moment. It arrives slowly, in unpaid bills, in emptied rooms, in the gradual withdrawal of a world that has moved on and not looked back. That is how the private life of the Carnegie Mansion ended. Andrew Carnegie died in August 1919 at his summer home in Lenox, Massachusetts. He was 83 years old. The First World War, which had devastated the peace movement to which he had devoted the final decade of his life, had broken something in him that money and optimism could not repair. Friends who saw him in his last years described a man diminished, quieter, slower, carrying a grief for a world that had chosen industrialized slaughter over the rational cooperation he had spent decades and millions trying to promote. He left behind a fortune still substantial despite his giving, a philanthropic network that would outlast him by more than a century, and a mansion on Fifth Avenue whose future was suddenly, uncomfortably uncertain. Louise Carnegie survived her husband by nearly 27 years, remaining in the mansion until her own death in 1946. This fact alone reframes the building's history significantly. The house is remembered as Andrew's, his library, his conservatory, his instrument of social power. But Louise lived within its walls for more than a quarter century after he was gone, longer than the two of them had occupied it together. What that long residence meant for her personally, the particular texture of inhabiting a house built around another person's ambitions and appetites, maintaining its staff and its rhythms and its social calendar in the absence of the person for whom all of it had been constructed, is not extensively documented. History, consistent with its treatment of the women in Carnegie's story, has left her largely in the margins. What is documented is the practical reality. The mansion's operating costs did not diminish with Andrew's death. 64 rooms required heating, staffing, and maintenance, whether they were being used for dinner parties with presidents or quietly occupied by a widow and a reduced household. The financial burden of sustaining a private residence of this scale, against the backdrop of changing tax structures and a labor market that was slowly, unevenly beginning to shift in workers' favor, was considerable. After Louise Carnegie's death in 1946, the mansion passed through a period of uncertainty that many buildings of its kind did not survive. The great Gilded Age palaces of Fifth Avenue were disappearing with accelerating speed, demolished for apartment buildings, their contents auctioned, their stones repurposed. The pressures that had made them impossible to maintain as private residences were the same pressures that made them difficult to save in any form. The economics of New York real estate, the changing tax environment, the simple fact that no private individual in the post-war era could sustain a 64-room household on the same terms that Carnegie's steel fortune had made possible. The mansion was saved by its conversion. The building eventually became the home of the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, a fate that Carnegie, with his lifelong commitment to education and public culture, might have found genuinely fitting. But conversion always requires sacrifice. Rooms were adapted. The relationship between the building and its contents shifted from private residence to public institution. The version of the house that visitors experience today is not the house that Carnegie built. It is a careful preservation of its shell, its formal rooms, its architectural bones, inhabited now by a different purpose. What was lost in that transition is difficult to fully quantify. The living texture of the household, the rhythms of its daily life, the presence of the staff in the service corridors, the particular atmosphere of a home that was also a stage. These cannot be preserved in any museum. They exist now only in documents, in photographs, in the faint impressions left by people who were there and took the trouble to write it down. The Cooper Hewitt today presents the Carnegie Mansion as a landmark of design and architectural heritage. The formal rooms have been restored with considerable care. The building is open to the public. The garden, which Carnegie loved, remains. What the institution has found more difficult, as most institutions do, is presenting the full complexity of the story behind the building. The comfortable version, the version that sits most easily alongside a museum dedicated to design and creativity, is the version of Carnegie the philanthropist, the man who gave away his fortune, who built libraries, who believed in the power of culture to elevate human life. The other version is harder to integrate into a museum experience. The homestead version, the service corridor version. The version in which the beauty of these rooms was purchased at a price that the people who paid it never appear in the guest books. That difficulty is not unique to the Cooper Hewitt. It is the central challenge of every historic house museum that exists in the shadow of the Gilded Age. The buildings survive. The full truth of how they came to be is still, in most cases, being negotiated. Walk through the Carnegie Mansion on a Tuesday afternoon in the present day, and you will encounter something that its original owner could not have entirely predicted and might have found both gratifying and quietly uncomfortable. You will find school children moving through the formal rooms with tablets, documenting design objects for a class assignment. You will find design professionals examining the architectural detailing with the focused attention of people who understand precisely what they are looking at. You will find tourists from a dozen countries photographing the staircase. You will find, occasionally, a visitor who stops in the library and simply stands there for a moment, looking at the room, looking at the books, feeling the particular weight of a space that was built by a specific person for specific reasons that the museum's wall text addresses only partially. The Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum has done considerable and genuine work in preserving and presenting the Carnegie Mansion. The restoration of the formal rooms is careful. The programming is serious. The institution takes its curatorial responsibilities with evident seriousness. And yet, the Carnegie Mansion, as presented to the public today, foregrounds certain aspects of its history with more confidence than others. Andrew Carnegie, the philanthropist, is present. The libraries, the endowments, the gospel of wealth, the vision of a man who believed that great fortunes carried great obligations. This version of the story is accessible, coherent, and architecturally supported by the rooms themselves. The library, the conservatory, the elegant restraint of the Georgian Revival exterior. These spaces narrate a particular kind of man. And the narration is not false. What receives less direct attention is the system that produced the building. The Homestead Strike, when it appears at all in the context of the mansion's interpretation, tends to appear as background context rather than as the central moral complication it actually represents. The labor that sustained the household, the 30 or 40 servants who moved through the service corridors, whose names are largely unrecorded, and whose working conditions are rarely the subject of interpretive programming, is present in the architecture, but largely absent from the story told about it. This is not unique to the Cooper Hewitt. It is the characteristic approach of historic house museums across America, an approach that is slowly, unevenly, beginning to change as institutions reckon more honestly with the full complexity of the histories they hold. Carnegie's reputation has undergone a significant reassessment in the years since economic inequality returned to the center of American public debate. The questions that his life raises about the concentration of wealth, about the relationship between private philanthropy and public accountability, about whether the giving away of a fortune morally neutralizes the manner in which it was accumulated, are not historical questions anymore. They are present-tense questions. Asked about present-tense billionaires, in a present-tense political climate that has made the Gilded Age feel less like a distant historical episode and more like a recurring pattern. In this context, Carnegie has become a more contested figure than the library builder mythology suggested. The homestead strike circulates more widely in public consciousness than it did a generation ago. The phrase robber baron has returned to active use. The gap between Carnegie's stated beliefs about labor and his actual conduct toward workers is discussed with a directness that the philanthropic institutions bearing his name have had to navigate carefully. The mansion sits at the center of this reassessment, physically and symbolically. It is the most intact surviving expression of what Carnegie's wealth actually looked like when translated into private life. It is the place where the abstraction of billions becomes concrete. 64 rooms, a conservatory, a staircase, a library, and where the questions about how those billions were made become unavoidable. There is a question that the Carnegie Mansion poses, quietly and persistently, to everyone who walks through it, and that no amount of careful curatorial interpretation has yet fully answered. What do we do with beauty that was built on harm? Not fictional harm, not attenuated historical harm that requires scholarly excavation to uncover, but documented harm. Men dead on a riverbank, wages cut, unions crushed, workers whose names we do not know because the system that employed them did not consider their names worth recording. The mansion is genuinely beautiful. The architecture is serious and accomplished. The library is a room that earns the emotional weight it carries. Carnegie's philanthropic legacy, whatever its motivations, whatever its limitations, changed the lives of millions of people who used the libraries he built and the institutions he funded. Both of these things are true simultaneously. The beauty is real, the cost is real, and the mansion, standing on Fifth Avenue more than a century after it was built, refuses to let either truth cancel out the other. That refusal is, finally, what makes it worth the visit. Not the staircase, not the conservatory, not the design objects in their careful cases, though all of these are worth your time. What makes it worth the visit is the discomfort that a genuinely honest encounter with the building produces. The feeling of holding two incompatible things at once and being unable to resolve them into a single, clean verdict. Carnegie wanted to be remembered. He built a house to ensure it. He succeeded, though perhaps not entirely in the way he intended.